Good morning, everyone, and good morning, or I guess good afternoon to Yael, who is joining us from Tel Aviv, from her lovely apartment, and I am joining you from my basement, as always, in Washington, D.C. I'm Jeremy Benamy, president of J Street, joined by Yael Patir, our director in Israel. We are coming together in an emergency briefing in light of the formation of an emergency government in Israel between Benjamin Netanyahu and the former leader of the opposition, now joining in partnership, Major General Benny Gantz. What we are engaged in as J Street in the course of the coming months in partnership with Yael and many Israeli groups is a very important campaign that I think is probably among the most important things that J Street has done in its existence, which is to raise as loud a voice as possible in opposition to the idea of Israeli unilateral annexation of parts of occupied territory on the West Bank. This whole video conference today will be exploring that issue in more detail and what can be done over the course of the next 70 days. But I want to highlight at the beginning of the call that we will have a lot of resources and a lot of actions for people to take over the course of these coming months at jstreet.org/stop-annexation. And I'd urge folks to go to that URL to sign our petition immediately, indicating your opposition, and then please forward that as broadly as possible. We would like to create a very large groundswell of opposition in the United States, and hopefully, Yael, it will join a large groundswell of opposition from Israel. So Yael, I'd love to jump right in. I saw that Yair Lapid gave an incredible and a really strong speech this morning that highlighted from his point of view not only the danger of annexation, but many of the other issues that Gantz has essentially sold out on. And I wanted to get your take on the strength of Israeli opposition. Will there be political opposition to annexation come July 1? And will Yair Lapid be leading the way on that?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everybody for joining. It's indeed the moment that J Street was created for in a way, or one of the moments that J Street was created for. So the leader of the opposition is member of Knesset Yair Lapid, head of Yesh Atid, that was one of the three parties that came together to form Blue and White. He indeed gave a very, very strong speech, followed by an email that I just got 1 hour ago, which headline was, "I'm sorry," in which he basically says that he's sorry for selling to his public and to his voters something that was basically a lie in trusting Gantz's leadership, using very, very harsh terms and words on a slew of issues that Gantz in his position, Lapid's position, gave up on. And one of the issues on the list is the issue of annexation. That was followed by another harsh post by member of Knesset Ofer Shelach, who was known to be Yesh Atid's person on diplomatic and political affairs and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset, and really the person that held that portfolio. And in his Facebook post, he basically points to a change in the position of both Gantz and Ashkenazi that were clearly, if not so much publicly, but he was quoting them in closed rooms, saying that they're very strongly against annexation, unilateral annexation, and then going into this deal and basically caving up on their position by allowing this government to move forward on annexation. And he, in the same post, he states unequivocally that Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid are against annexation of any type, and they will fight against it as hard as possible. So that is the position of most of the opposition at this point.
One of the things that is very difficult for the United States and for activists here who hold positions that are pro-peace, anti-annexation, pro-two states, one of the difficulties is always when we stake out positions and there isn't an Israeli political voice or strong position that we are echoing and sharing, and it's very hard for us to oppose things, but it would be unbelievably helpful to know that there is going to be a very strong Israeli political opposition to this kind of move. Can you help our viewers today understand exactly what the coalition agreement does call for? It doesn't call for annexation of the West Bank today. It lays out a timetable and it lays out a set of conditions under which annexation could move forward. So could you walk us through that?
The language of the agreement gives a green light to move forward on annexation without any specification of what annexation means. Is it moving forward on just legislation that will make it possible, on actual on what kind of annexation? Could be many, many different things. So it doesn't specify exactly what it is. It does say that on July 1st, it can start rolling, given three conditions, I would say. One is that there is consent from the US. Two, that it's not harming the peace agreement that Israel currently has. And three, that it preserves Israel's security, assets, and national interests, something of the matter. I mean, not the exact translation. So really, we know that until July 1st, nothing is going to move forward on that front. But after July 1st, we don't really know what is going to move forward, in what pace. And surely there's a lot of opportunity to shape that. I'll just finish my answer with quoting both member of Knesset and chairman of Labor, Amir Peretz, who is going to be part of this government, as well as quotes by Gantz, that was to say that they will be able to influence from within the government. Gantz will be the Minister of Defense, and Ashkenazi, who's Gantz's number 2 and also a former chief of staff, is going to be the foreign minister. So they took two ministries, two positions, which are the positions in which you can really influence this issue, and they are telling us that they plan to do whatever they can to influence it from the inside. Another point, sorry, Jeremy, is to say that according to the agreement, any decision on legislation on annexation can either take place in the cabinet, in the government, or in the Knesset. So it doesn't have to be approved by the whole cabinet. It could be only approved by the Knesset, by the members of Knesset.
Great. So the bottom lines out of that are, we have 70 days until July 1 to bring the maximum voice and opposition to this from all across the spectrum, whether it's from American policymakers and politicians, American Jewish communal leaders, international voices, to make it clear why this should not move forward. So that's the basis of our 70-day campaign. At that point, what exactly would be annexed in terms of the geography, that's unclear. It could be one settlement, right? It could be the entire Jordan Valley. For all we know, it could be the entirety of the West Bank. That is not specified, so we don't have that clarified. And in terms of the sort of conditions of what allows it to move forward, let's take each of them in order. The consent of the United States, that is also not defined. One presumes that from the settler point of view and from the right-wing perspective, simply having the okay of President Trump and Jared Kushner and David Friedman, that constitutes consent of the United States. But that isn't defined, and Congress does have a role to play here. Do you think that congressional voices and congressional action in the course of these next 2 months can have an influence on how people like Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi view the situation?
Absolutely. The way I read the agreement, when it says Israel maintaining its assets, security assets, I think it's very clear, definitely in the minds of the generals, definitely, and this is from, you know, many conversations and from quotes and interviews and so on, that perhaps the number one biggest asset that Israel has is the relationship with the US and its bipartisan nature. And maybe the second is the peace agreement with Jordan and with Egypt. And I think that Congress making a strong statement that while this plan or whatever the Israeli-American committee will agree on might be okay or approved by the certain administration, it is not okay and approved by the Democrats and the majority of the Americans, because this administration doesn't necessarily represent, the majority of Americans, the majority of American Jewry, or the perhaps soon to be president that will occupy the White House. So doing such a big move during an election season in the U.S. where you don't know the results of the president, you don't know what you're going to get, and you don't know what will be the implications of Israel, is basically giving the best sort of bullets, the best ammunition. Thank you, for those in Israel that want to fight the annexation.
And I know that there is a train of thought, and I see some of it in the chat and some of it in the Q&A, that is asking, what is the chance if, in fact, annexation, let's discuss what annexation actually is. What does it mean in terms of Israeli law? Is there ever a chance for there to then one day down the road be a peace agreement between Israel and Palestinians and its neighbors that creates a viable state of Palestine? Is this the end of the story, or is annexation of pieces of the West Bank reversible? And how similar is it in law to what was done with the areas of East Jerusalem back 40 plus years ago?
So I'll answer quickly and then send it back to you, Jeremy, especially when talking about laws, because you're a lawyer and my legal English is not as good as yours. But I will say that I think that there's very much, first of all, you have to have your basic belief. I mean, my basic belief is that without two states, there will never be peace. So for any peace to have, it has to be through a two-state solution, and whatever is annexed can also be, is then the territory on which we have to negotiate. So I'm saying this because I'm an internal optimistic, and this is the thing that I fight for and I think is the most important. So I can't, in the event that annexation does take place, I'm not willing to say, okay, that's it, we won't have peace ever again. So that's, just one general point that is very important for me to make. And yes, I mean, Israel did annex East Jerusalem and apply its law there and gave the citizens residency, and the laws are supposedly they're supposed to live, but then in no way is it implemented, and people that came to see the situation in Jerusalem and understand exactly what I'm talking about. But for sure, annexation on all its different scenarios will cause a domino effect that will push us that far away from the ability to do peace. First and foremost, because you're not doing it in agreement with another side. So where does it put the Palestinians and their willingness to negotiate with Israel? And then the domino effect of the security implementations for Israel. We talked about the Jordan peace treaty. We talked about implementing the law. All of the Israeli legal system will have to change. And if Palestinians are not given full citizenship and rights, then Israel is no longer a democracy. And I'm sure that, you know, those who are promoting annexation will want to change the legal system to allow Israel not to become a one-state democracy for all, because they want to keep it a Jewish state. And that will take us down the road of Israel losing its democratic character.
So let's take this, you know, sort of slowly. There's a lot of questions flowing in the chat and the Q&A, and I want to make sure that our goal in this briefing is to really help people understand exactly what's going to happen. So the reason why we're talking about July 1, some people are saying, why July 1? That is in the coalition agreement. I mean, that's been agreed to by Gantz and Netanyahu. Nothing is going to happen on this front between now and July 1. The second thing that we have been discussing is, what exactly does annexation mean? Does it mean that Israel seizes full control and sovereignty of the entirety of the West Bank? We don't know that, right? The question is, will it be 30% of the West Bank as anticipated by the Trump-Kushner map? Will it be one settlement, let's say Ma'ale Adumim? Will it be the Gush Etzion area? Will there be a phased process? None of that do we know. None of that is specified in the coalition agreement, and that will have to be determined by whatever the proposal is that Netanyahu has worked out with the United States, because according to the coalition agreement, one can only move forward with something that has been agreed upon with the United States. So there is a committee that has been meeting since February, a US-Israel commission to draw a map. And that's something we know, that commission is meeting, and we know it will finish its work by July 1. And based on that agreement between the US and Israel, some form of proposal to extend Israel's law to cover certain areas of the occupied territory will be put forward, either in the cabinet or in the Knesset. And Benny Gantz has the opportunity to stop it in the cabinet, because it can only move forward in the cabinet with the agreement of the cabinet. And if he and his people stop it, then it goes to the Knesset. And we believe in the Knesset there's more than enough votes for whatever that proposal is to pass. Is that a summary of sort of where we're at, Yael? Does that all sound right? Terrific. Now, if some of the territory that is annexed includes Palestinian residents, is it at all clear yet? And that might be 100,000 Palestinians, it might be 150,000 Palestinians, it's not clear. It's not the entirety of the Palestinians on the West Bank. Is that group granted citizenship? How does that relate to the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem? There's about 300,000 Palestinians who already live in annexed land who are not full citizens. What's your best guess on whether or not there will be any offer to that 100,000 Palestinians?
It goes hand in hand with what is going to be implemented and where. We've been hearing, if I take the public positions of members of Yemina, which is the party right of Likud that is associated with the settler movement, there were public statements in which they said, you know, there's 10 to 20,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley, let's say. I mean, the numbers are very, very, very differently from where you sit politically, but
they're
I'm
fluid.
Just quoting so it was said, so we'll grant them full citizenship. You know, for the 10,000, that would be okay. Obviously, it's not only 10,000, and anything you know, bigger than that Palestinians won't be granted residency nor citizenship. So as I said before, there will have to be a lot of amendments to the Israeli law to be able to give justification, legal justification to these different systems. Currently, we have two different legal systems for Palestinians and Israelis that live in the West Bank, but they are in place and they are justified because of the military rule, because it's a military rule system that applies to the Palestinians. once there's annexation, that system is no longer relevant because they're part of the state of Israel.
In the parts
which is
that
why
have been
I'm saying
annexed, in the
exactly.
parts, the 70%
Right.
of the West Bank where 90+% of the Palestinians live would still be under military occupation with military law. It's only in the annexed territory. So one of the places that I would recommend that people should visit, a website to learn more about the impact of even a partial annexation, is the Commanders for Israel Security. And you've used the term a domino effect that begins when you annex part of the West Bank. And on the Commanders for Israel Security site, they lay out this series of dominoes that will topple and ultimately lead to the loss of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. Could you just outline in very thumbnail what some of those dominoes are? If you start with extending Israel's law to just a portion of the West Bank, how does that lead you down that path almost inevitably in their analysis towards the loss of Jewish and democratic quality of Israel?
So I think I covered the issue of the democratic nature and the need to change the legal structure. Another great concern is the PA, basically, and will it have both the authority and the incentive to keep itself in place? If in the event, and I think that there will be, and it's very safe to assume that there will be violent reaction and clashes, the PA would not be able to provide the security coordination that it currently provides. If that, with all the economic pressure also that is, especially in, nowadays, given the Trump administration cuts, given the coronavirus and so on, it's very hard to see a situation where the PA could hold its position. And once the PA is not in place, then that has a severe effect on Israel's security, because a lot of it depends today on the coordination, as well as on, again, it's the end of the Oslo agreement, it's the end of the current infrastructure that we have in place on the way to reaching a final settlement agreement. So it's chaos, and it's very hard to to imagine how you get out of it. Another piece of the puzzle is regional stability, which is I think has major impact. We talked about Jordan and Egypt, the peace agreements that Israel has with them. The peace agreement with both of them is dependent on the arrangement with the Palestinians. And the peace agreement with Egypt, it's part of the agreement. The peace agreement with Jordan is very much dependent on the relationship with the Palestinian, the border with the future Palestinian state. Very hard to see also with their majority Palestinian population in Jordan, how they can keep the peace agreement. And I think that the peace agreement with Jordan is definitely understood as Israel's biggest security barrier, right, from the threat that it faces from the east.
And has
so
the
those
king
are just
been vocal? Has the king been explicit about that in recent days or weeks? And do you expect more of that in the next couple of months?
I expect more of that. He hasn't been vocal yet, to the best of my knowledge, and I invite our participants to share if they've seen something that I've missed. After the Trump plan, there has been a number of official statements coming out of the Hashemic Kingdom by senior officials. They haven't stated clearly the consequences, but they did state that it's a huge risk and that there will be consequences for the relationship with Jordan.
I want to take a moment, just as we're hitting the halfway mark of this conversation, to remind folks that J Street is launching a 70-day campaign to make American opposition to annexation clear to Israeli decision makers. You can join our campaign at jstreet.org/stop-annexation. We will have a series of different activities and actions that we're going to be taking over the course of the coming weeks and months. It's an unbelievably I think important moment for us to step forward and press our senators, our members of Congress, to press Vice President Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee, to press other public figures to make their opposition to annexation clear, to root that opposition in our belief in the need for a democratic and secure state of Israel, and that annexation undercuts that. And that argument is the core of Israel's retired security community. One of the themes, again, of the questions in the chat is a question for J Street, which is, what are the kinds of consequences that we are going to stand for should annexation move forward? And we've made it very, very clear, Yael, that we do not believe that the United States should foot the bill for anything related to annexation, that there should be restrictions. If this happens, there should be restrictions on the use of American military assistance so that it can't be used to implement annexation. We've also said that up till now, the United States has provided clear diplomatic protection for Israel in international bodies from almost every single attempt to hold it accountable for its activities in the occupation, and that kind of a umbrella of diplomatic immunity that depended on the United States might not be there in the future. These kinds of actions are not going to happen under the Trump administration. We know that, and we have a Republican-controlled Senate, and it's not going to pass legislation that puts any restrictions on the use of military aid. But this November, we have a very important election. And in addition to stopping annexation, J Street's other key priority is to change the politics of this country and to change the leadership. And it's not out of the question that come January, there could be a Democratic president, there could be a Democratic-controlled Senate to go along with a Democratic-controlled House. And it might take a very different view on some of these very questions if annexation has moved forward. Do you think that the Israeli public, broadly speaking, understands the potential consequence to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and particularly to the bipartisan nature of that relationship, should annexation move forward? Is that at all in the consciousness, or is that something that we really have an obligation to put front and center for the next 2 months?
I think that it's the consciousness that the relationship is important and the bipartisan nature of it is very much, I think, front and center in the minds of Israelis, which is why they give, I think, a lot of respect to the U.S. president, regardless of who that is, and to and to a Trump plan, regardless of what it says, just because it was presented by the American president. That seems very important, I think, to Israel and all the regional our neighbors, as somebody mentioned in the chat. Is the public aware of the consequences of where Democrats stand? I'm sorry to say that no. Going back to Yair Lapid, he did mention in one of his posts or tweets or whatever that the agreement, the coalition agreement, and moving forward on annexation will severely damage the relationship with the U.S. and with American Jewry. But I don't think that that's a notion that is understood. I think just having one significant American figure give an interview in Israel, which is something that hasn't happened lately, with that position will be a huge asset, for making the case for Israelis. And then also, again, something that the politicians here can use to that end.
Well, you've given us the first item on our to-do list, then, is to get somebody on TV in Israel.
Absolutely.
There's a number of questions that are asking, where do you think the Israeli public actually stands on annexation? What is the public opinion on the question?
Yeah, so let me be extremely clear on what I know. There's been, when it comes to annexation as a whole, there's a very low support in the public, less than 30%. When you ask them about annexation, are they pro or against, they will say they're against. Having said that, there is actually majority support for annexation of the Jordan Valley, because the Jordan Valley is a place that is relatively accessible to Israelis, and I think, and it's not, it's like Israelis not understanding East Jerusalem being, you know, not beyond the Green Line or anything like that. There's a sense that the Jordan Valley is part of Israel, so it's easier to agree to it. And it's also, it should be said that historically speaking, you know, the labor movement was the movement that settled the Jordan Valley. So it's quite a popular stand, which is also why Benny Gantz, when Netanyahu said, if I'm elected, or tomorrow, if you remember, he gave that press conference, he said, I'm going to annex the Jordan Valley. And Benny Gantz found it very difficult to say, I'm against it. He said, you know, we can do it with the cooperation and agreement with our neighbors, you know. So it was a yes with a little bit of a no, but not really a strong no. And that's because that's where the public is. Having said all that, currently the issue of annexation is not part of the, you know, is not part of the debate so much, of course, because of the Corona crisis, which is much more in front and center in people's minds. And I think it's the responsibility of us Israelis to make it, you know, an issue that people are upset about. And one of the ways to do it for an Israeli public is to connect the fight for democracy, which is, I don't know if you saw the photo from Rabin Square with full of people demonstrating just a few days ago with 2 meters between them, and it had the heads of all the opposition parties on the stage, including the head of the joint list and including Yael. That fight for democracy and for you know, the rule of law in Israel has big support, and I think our mission is to connect that fight with the fight against annexation, to make that connection in people's minds that currently does not exist.
So we talked about how the coalition agreement lists 3 different conditions under which annexation can be moved forward, and one is with the approval of the US government. The others go back to what you just said about where Gantz's position had been. Gantz had said he would support it in coordination with our neighbors and the international community. But that got changed in the coalition agreement. It's no longer essentially a condition. It just simply has to be, it has to be discussed, correct? Can you give some nuance about what are the
in
other,
dialogue.
Right, in dialogue with the neighboring countries, or in dialogue with our partners in peace treaties? What was the exact?
No, the exact phrasing was while keeping the peace agreement and in dialogue with internationals.
So it has to keep the peace treaty. So if Jordan were to say that annexation would break the peace treaty, theoretically that would be enough to say that condition hasn't been met. So that's something we'll have to see over the next few weeks, that specifically. And the other is, quote unquote, in dialogue with. And what exactly do you think that means? Do you have any interpretation?
I mean, I see it as something that Blue and White put in the agreement to give them maneuvering room, right? To say, you know, there's too much pressure from the outside, we can't really do it. It's too close to the election in the US. We don't know, you know, how it will be perceived and so on. So it's giving them the space and in some way welcoming, you know, international reaction so that they could use it. But it's very loose. I mean, the way it's written. Plus, we have to be honest, right? At the end of the day, Blue and White doesn't have a veto right on annexation, which is what we would have wanted in an ideal world, to know that annexation is not going to happen.
So a few of the questions that are coming up. One is a question specifically, has Biden made clear his opposition to annexation? And he absolutely has. He even did it in a video to AIPAC. Not only did he have the video to us, but he made it clear in his video to AIPAC. He's had a couple of other public statements on the question as well. I know that we are publicly and privately asking the campaign to, reiterate some of those statements and maybe even just repackage what he's already said, so that it really is clear that a President Joe Biden would not accept this annexation. Until the Trump administration, the United States and no one else around the world had ever accepted or recognized Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, let alone this. And one can presume that a President Biden and a next administration would return to the traditional view of what annexation is: an illegal act under the Geneva Convention and an illegal act under international law. And so that has been made clear. We'd like to hear it again, and certainly we'll be asking for reiteration. Another question was, what is the current stance of Congress towards annexation? And I'm proud to say that J Street was very actively involved in the passage of House Resolution 326 back in December already, because we've been working on this issue for many months now, since it first surfaced in the political discourse probably over a year ago. And the Congress of the United States, the House of Representatives, did pass a resolution, and it had bipartisan support. There was a handful of Republicans supporting it as well, that specifically put the Congress of the United States on record opposing annexation. And so we've since seen as well some additional letters and some additional resolutions introduced. And in the wake of the formation of this government, one of the things that Jason will be pushing for is for a reiteration of that kind of congressional opposition. So that, I just wanted to answer some of the American points of view on this. Yael, there are some questions that are coming up that are related to other aspects of this agreement. For instance, the Justice Ministry, who gets the Justice Ministry in this new arrangement, and what impact does that then have on Netanyahu's trials and on the potentially further investigations? When does the trial start? What happens? Does annexation go on hold if the trial starts? There's a bunch of questions related to law and justice and the investigation. So maybe you could bundle them all together and give an answer.
Yeah, so let me start by saying that the agreement is bad, feels bad. When you read it, it gives you a very strong punch in the stomach. And if you follow Israeli news, both in the sort of your regular commentators are super critical over it, especially for the issues of the judges and the ministry and the committees and so on, as well as maybe two other issues, and consider it a very weak agreement from the point of view of Gantz. So I actually spent today looking for other opinions to balance it out. Obviously, we all know that we live also in the information bubbles, right? And we hear what we agree with. So I want to say, I'll go over the details quickly, but I want to say for all of us that whatever the agreement that was made can't be put against an ideal situation. It has to be put against what were the options. And when the agreement was signed, Netanyahu, once Gantz did not form, when he got the mandate from the president, once he did not form a minority government, which was his only viable move not to have Netanyahu as the prime minister, once he did not do that, and he decided that it's not a good thing to do for a country under crisis to have a minority government, and he went to a unity government. Once that decision was made, really the options were limited. So I just want to say, whatever we look in a critical mode, as we should compare it to what would have happened if Netanyahu would have become prime minister without having blue and white, right? And would have had the same sort of narrow right-wing government that he had before. I mean, it would have been worse. So keep that in mind. On the judicial front, there are a number of issues. One is who's the Minister of Justice. Two is who is appointed to the position of State Attorney. Three is who heads the relevant committees, the Constitution Committee and the Knesset Committee and the Knesset. Three is how you appoint judges. That's basically the four things that have to do with Netanyahu's trial. Netanyahu's trial is going to start. One of the things that the big wins that he got in this agreement is that, as probably a lot of you know, according to the Israeli law, a prime minister cannot serve under accusation, and if he's not indicted, but if there's a decision convicted. Thank you. And basically, what Gantz has given him in the agreement is the possibility after the rotation ends, after a year and a half. So while he's undergoing trial, to be the deputy prime minister. So it's really legitimizing the idea that you can be a prime minister under indictment. This issue is now going to be heard in the Supreme Court. It's very important to say there's a number of petitions on all different elements in the coalition agreement. The coalition agreement will demand to legislations in the Knesset to allow for this rotation. So all these pieces of legislation that need to be passed, as well as the agreement, will be petitioned against and has already been petitioned against to the Supreme Court. And now the ball is in the court of the Supreme Court to decide whether indeed Netanyahu, according to the law, can form the government, and it's going to be a very messy and ugly play. But again, I go back to the point that I started with. It could have been worse. We had a very bad Minister of Justice, Amir Ohana from the Likud, who was really a criminal, had no respect for the law. Now there's a blue and white Minister of Justice. He's also the head of the ministerial committee that approves all the legislation by the government. So there's a lot of things that Netanyahu got from this agreement, and I won't go over all of them, but it's also not as worse as it could have been, and there will be elements in which blue and white is really protecting the judiciary in a way that there was nobody to protect it there before.
And Maurice Harris asks a good question, which is that if the High Court does rule in the coming weeks that Netanyahu can't serve as prime minister, the coalition agreement states fourth elections must be held. Does that mean that Gantz would immediately take over until the fourth elections, or Netanyahu would then continue to be an interim as he has been?
I think Netanyahu continues to be an interim.
Yeah, that's my thought as well.
Yeah.
So another strain of the questions and comments relates to American politics and the question specifically of where is AIPAC on this issue. And for anybody who is watching us, who belongs to AIPAC or supports AIPAC, I ask you to ask them. It is notable the silence of AIPAC and many more right-of-center organizations on the question of annexation, when they have tried to say through the years that they support two states. And it's been a very vague notion of two states, the two-state solution without specifics. But if you go down this path that has been begun by this coalition agreement, and you do have a minimum of partial annexation, the possibility of two states is really undercut. And so where does the mainstream fall? I am hoping to hear very loud and very strong statements from the leadership of mainstream organizations, from the heads of federations, from the heads of the Jewish movements, from the heads of organizations that are parts of the Conference of Presidents. The Conference of Presidents should come out against this concept. But if they are going to be hijacked and controlled by the Zionist Organization for America and the farthest right wing, then we know where those institutions will end up. So I don't know what AIPAC will end up saying about annexation. The general position is they support whatever it is that the government of Israel does. Well, if the government of Israel does this, one hopes that this is enough to end that kind of a Israel right or wrong, its government right or wrong positioning. It certainly is J Street's view that the most pro-Israel position to take is to actually do everything you can to make it clear that the Israeli government should not do this. But we have not seen a statement from AIPAC, and assuming that there will be movement in Congress to make some statements, quite loud and large statements from Congress, it'll be interesting to see if AIPAC and other groups lobby against it. And so that's a little bit of a take on AIPAC. There's also some questions about other politics here. Doug Krantz, for instance, is raising the issue of the religious right, the Christian right, and whether or not politically this is a play from Trump to his base in advance of the November elections. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what the more liberal mainstream of the American Jewish community says, because they would have voted against Trump anyway. What is he doing to give things that his core base constituency wants? And sadly, this is how Israel has become a partisan football. This is how it has become an issue where one side of the political spectrum is trying to play it for their political advantage. And I think, again, Yael, I don't know whether or not this is fully understood in Israel, but it's always been seeming a point of pride for Israelis that there's this large bedrock of evangelical Christian support for the state of Israel. But I don't know that there's an understanding that when you put it into the political arena, what that leads you to is the farthest right wing policies that actually end up dividing America, dividing Democrats and Republicans, and undercutting the U.S.-Israel relationship. Do you think that, again, any of this is penetrating in Israel?
I would say that Trump's administration has made it very, very clear to progressives in Israel, and I would say that progressives didn't get it before, or people on the center left, and I think that there's an understanding amongst those who need to understand it, whether it's something that the public as a whole understands. I wouldn't say so.
There's also some chatter here about the Pompeo statement. You and I, just before we came onto this briefing, we were seeing on Twitter that Pompeo was saying, quote unquote, this is an Israeli decision, as if the whole question wasn't being pushed along by the Trump peace sham, right? In the very beginning, all of this flows from the unveiling of a map by Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, drawn by David Friedman, that actually gives the green light for this to happen. And specifically in the coalition agreement, it says that this must be done with the approval of the United States. It can only move forward with the approval of the United States. So not that I think anybody involved in J Street had any illusions that Secretary Pompeo was actually acting as a Secretary of State, but this is just another example of a complete abdication of responsibility for diplomacy on behalf of the United States Secretary of State. And so, of course, Charlotte, we will continue to challenge Mike Pompeo. We will continue to challenge the foreign policy of this administration. Yael, I wanted to just see if you had any other pieces. We have about 10 minutes left. Are there any other pieces of the annexation conversation that you think are critical for people to understand at this moment in time in terms of what we need to do? What's the campaign in Israel going to look like? I know you're going to be at the center of this. What are the Israeli groups that we are allied with? What are you going to do over the course of the next 70 days?
So I think we don't know yet. Where it's coming together. I will say that there's a few. When we're looking at J Street's allies in Israel, I'm happy to say that we have a very broad alliance, and I would differentiate between probably a few lines of communication, of messages, of framing. So you mentioned the Commanders for Israel Security that are in front of this fight. They've been focusing on annexation for a while now. They have very, very strong and deep material. You can add to the Commanders for Israel Security also the INSS, the Israeli National Security Institute, which is not a partisan or a political organization, but has a plan on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which the institute endorses as an institute, and the plan doesn't see, according to the plan, the Trump plan, any of the elements are not accepted, because while they do see value in Israel taking unilateral steps in some cases, they also mentioned that they have to be coordinated with the Palestinians and in some sort of an agreement and with an arrangement that the Palestinians get something in a clear commitment from Israel in return. So there's the line, I think, of the security, of why this is so detrimental for Israeli security. I think it's the strongest argument for the Israeli public, and it will be represented by people that come from a security background, which we understand is the position of the majority of the security establishment in Israel. On that note, I will also say, again, going back to my comparison comment, that it's much, much better to have Benny Gantz as the Minister of Defense than Naftali Bennett, the representative of the settlers, as the Ministry of Defense. So that keeps me sleeping a little bit better at night. There will also be a line that will connect the issue of democracy, and we'll try to create a very broad coalition. I think we would want to keep the faith or the leadership of this fight as broad as possible. And there will also be those who would focus on the Palestinian, the Palestinian situation, Palestinian human rights, what that entails in terms of a forever occupation, of the possibility of them reaching independence, on their standing in the world, and so on and so forth. I don't think that that's a convincing argument to the Israeli public, I have to say, but there's a strong Israeli civil society, and we have really good human rights organizations that are focusing on that. And I think our aim, and you mentioned that I will be in the center of it, I sure hope so, but our aim would really be to create as broad a front as possible that will say no to any annexation, meaning not yes to the Jordan Valley or to Ma'ale Adumim because that is okay, but that any step of annexation is, especially under the Trump plan, which gives you the whole umbrella, is unacceptable.
So, folks are wondering, are we connected to the popular coexistence, left of center, social democratic Israeli groups? The answer is very much yes. We feature them all the time in our work and at our conferences. We have featured them in special profiles on the JStream. So certainly we are going to continue to work very, very closely with our allies, and Yael is right at the center of all of that. I want to invite everybody on this webinar to once again join us at jstreet.org/stop-annexation. We'll post the URL one last time up on the screen so that folks can go there, not only sign up and join our effort, but please circulate that URL in your communities, among your allies, in your synagogues and elsewhere, so that we can build as broad a movement as possible. I also ask folks to consider we are going to be spending some extra funds in this very difficult time to try to heighten our visibility in this moment, and we're going to spend some money on this campaign and supporting some of the work in Israel. So now is a time that we'd ask you to consider donating to J Street and supporting our work. These are tough financial times, I know that, and they're tough for all nonprofits, but if this is an issue that motivates you and you care about, I hope you'll see fit to chip in to our work. And I'll highlight, I see the comments as well in the chat about, you know, the Biden campaign, and J Street is proud to have endorsed Joe Biden for president. And we bring together under our umbrella at J Street people who supported a wide range of people during the course of the primary process, and folks that were all over the map in the Democratic internal debates. But I think, Yael, that we can agree from both sides of the ocean and as citizens of the globe, there is no more significant priority for those of us who care about peace, who care about the world, who care about diplomacy, who care about public health, who care about climate change. There's just nothing more important than defeating Donald Trump come November. And it is vital for us to have a new direction, a new leadership, and that's why we've endorsed Joe Biden. We will work very closely with his team, and we know them well. We will try to push them. My good friend David from Florida, yes, we will push to try to make this next administration as aligned with J Street as possible on these issues. And we are excited by the choice that we have in November, and we'll be working hard for him. So Yael, any final thoughts for us as we close up this webinar?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everybody for joining us, and really appreciate your support. Know that there are partners in Israel that are going to fight hard for this, and that, you know, you're doing something which is really stopping annexation at this point is in the best interest of Israel as well as Palestine. So thank you for your involvement and your support.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for all the nice comments in the chat, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and, most importantly, continuing the work together. Thanks, Yael.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.